We're going to work on reconstructing the pawn shop activity. If you haven't already listened to Pawn Accounting Explained, the prior video, you need to do that first so that you'll be able to follow what we're doing. So before we get started, I wanted to make a correction here. The inventory markup, what Workman tells us here, is that he typically sells for the loan times 2. That would be a 100% markup, not a 200% markup. I just wanted to fix that in the data file that you had. Let's start by calculating what we think the interest might have been as opposed to what was actually deposited. So if you had loans of $91,230 and the monthly interest rate was 20% and the average length was 4 months. So I don't want you to use your calculator and type in the amount here and use Excel as a typewriter. I want you to use Excel to create a model that will be linked to the assumptions here. And the key for that is it allows you to change the assumptions and information will update, and that'll be very useful to the children and to anybody that's going to work with Mr. Workman in getting these amounts repaid and negotiating the final amounts. So plus or equals, and then point at the 91, and then times the 4 months and times the interest rate, and then hit enter. And then you do the same thing for the next year. Plus or equals the loan amount times 4 months times the interest rate. And so you can see that based on the variables we're assuming, we know the interest rate, we're assuming the $91,000 is all of it. Probably not. There were probably some loans made out of the cash drawer. So we would think conservatively that we would expect in excess of $70,000 to have been deposited to the business for interest, and it was closer to $60,000. And we would want Workman to repay that. All right, what about forfeited items? What was the dollar amount of items forfeited from these loans? So we're going to do plus or equals and the 91,000, and the forfeit amount is 40% of the loans. So we would expect that amount to have been forfeited. And let's do the next year, the 97,000 times the 40%. And now if we change this to 35, see the numbers shift around. So once we're done, we can play with these assumptions, or while they're negotiating with Workman, they can say, okay, I'll change it to 35, but then here's the amount we think you owe. So anything in that range is probably believable. So now the sales price of the forfeited items, of course, is going to be forfeited items times 2. And then the loans that would have been repaid would have been the ones that did not default. So it would be the loans times, and open parentheses, 1 minus that default rate. And we do it like that so that if we change the default rate, it will change the calculation of, okay, if those didn't default, then these must have been the ones that were repaid. So plus the 97 times, open parentheses, 1 minus, and then point to the default rate. So that would, the reciprocal of the default rate is the collection rate. So these are the loans that we think would have been collected, which again is about 8 to 10,000 more than what was actually deposited to the business. And these are probably understated amounts up here. So we think that there were some collections that were not deposited to the business, and we think there was interest that was not deposited to the business if the average loan was 4 months, which we're not sure about. The big piece of this, of course, is that the inventory that was forfeited that Workman either took or gave away or sold is missing from the business, and that's a even bigger number. Okay. Let's now reconstruct the pawn shop activity. How does that pawn business look? So let's say repayment of pawn loans. We are pointing at these numbers, not typing them in, so that as we change assumptions, all of these amounts here will update. Sale of pawn items estimate, so you plus and then point at the one that you want and then hit enter. Okay, now the interest we're going to separate into two lines. The interest that they did report, or well, they commingled with sales, but they deposited to the business, and then the interest that they didn't. So we have the interest that did get into the business, which is the green cells. And then the interest that didn't is the difference between what we think interest might have been and what got deposited. So plus the interest we calculated less the amount that went into the business. And we're separating that out so that we can then come down here after we've looked at the whole business to see how it's doing, to see the amounts that Workman took from the business that we want him to repay. Okay, so the total interest, so I'll go up here to my sigma. Be careful that it's going to capture the date because it thinks it's a number, so you want to fix that range there. And then you can grab this corner and drag it across if you like, and that formula will go all the way across. And then the cost of the loans would be what they spent on them, which is the cash that went out, and we don't know how much cash came from the cash drawer, so that's the only number we have. And so the profits would have been all the income, the interest, the repayments, and the sales on the forfeited items, less what we gave to the customers initially, which is our cost in all of that activity. And then for both years, add those two up, copy it down, copy that formula to that cell, and there we go. So the pawn shop business looks terrific, doesn't it? You could compare this to the profits from the non-pawn business, and you can see that the prior owner was right. It's a very promising business. And prior to the pawn shop getting started, they thought the entire business was only worth $350,000. Well, in 2 years, the pawn shop alone has earned, a good fraction of that. So what from the financial statements here does Workman owe the owners? So the sale of the pawn items we don't believe was deposited at all in the business, and then the unreported interest, and then the unreported loan payments. So we think the loan payments might have been that amount, and they did deposit the amount in green. So we will make that little calculation there. All right, copy down the formula from above, or you can just rebuild it, whatever pleases you. Let's be careful that it wants to pick up the date in that series. And so we have just under 200,000, conservatively probably, that Workman owes us from the pawn shop activity. That's in addition to the items that we noticed from the general ledger activity in the revised financial statements. So in your report, you'll want to make a distinction of that he owes both those amounts. Okay, after this, we're ready to start talking about the written report and how these schedules will be used in the written report to support your comment.